will you go out with me? It's a simple phrase, really, right? But it just kind of packs a punch a little bit. Will you go out with me? For some, just hearing these words might bring up some fond memories, right? The first time you asked and finally got that yes you've been longing for, or maybe when you had finally heard the words from that person you've been pining for forever. For others, maybe your feelings right now are a little less positive. Maybe you're feeling a little anxious because there's somebody you've been meaning to ask, but you just haven't worked up the nerve yet. Maybe confusion because you're like, Molly, nobody says that anymore. We don't do that. Fear because you're afraid things are about to get like super practical and we're going to do some speed dating. That's not happening. Will you go out with me? It might not be a question that you actually used or heard, but my guess is you want to, right? See, at some point, we all want to hear this phrase because whether or not we actually use it in this way, no matter how far removed we are from arranged marriages and courtship and going steady or whatever it was our great-grandparents did, we still live in a culture that kind of thinks a lot about romantic relationships, right? It's kind of a big deal. Maybe we don't have suitors that come calling or even call us, but we have Facebook and Snapchat and texting. We have Tinder, Bumble, OkCupid, Coffee Meets Bagel, and Match.com, and Christian Mingle, and Farmers Only. There's a few apps and a few ways that we try to communicate, that we try to maybe find love. And if you take a closer look, it's not just these, it's our media, right? And it's not just those romantic comedies, which, yes, of course, they focus on love, but think for a minute. Action and adventure movies, right? James Bond, Indiana Jones, who are they without their leading ladies? And comedy? The Office is not The Office without Jim and Pam. Superheroes? I mean, Superman has Lois Lane, Spider-Man has MJ. It's everywhere, right? And then think about those reality TV shows. The Bachelor, The Bachelorette. How about The Proposal? Have you guys heard about this show called The Proposal? It came on this summer. Guys, here's what happens. It was billed as a soulmate pageant. I'm not kidding. They put one person in this box, it concealed who it was, and it had 14 contestants. And at the end of a 1-hour show, we had a proposal. Madness. That's what that is. What are we supposed to do? Here we are in this world that tells us we need love, and it gives us all these tools and techniques we're supposed to use to get it. But some of those techniques seem crazy, and maybe if you use some of those tools or you know someone who has, you realize that at the end of the day, some people just kind of end up feeling a little bit discouraged, a little bit helpless, and mostly just exhausted. So, what are we supposed to do? Maybe if you've been around the church for a while, you've turned to the church to look for some answers about what we're supposed to think about dating and love, right? That's a good idea. And I hope that if you have turned to Christians in your life, to the church, you got some great guidance. But if we're being honest with ourselves, sometimes Christians, we have our own version of crazy when it comes to dating and love. Maybe you heard some things that sounded a little bit like this.
But that's the world we find ourselves in, right? If we look to the world, we're getting all these crazy ideas about love. But sometimes when we look to the church or to Christians in our lives, we hear some pretty weird stuff too. What are we supposed to do? More importantly, what does God, not just culture, whether it's Christian culture or the regular culture, have to say about this whole area of our life? At the beginning of the letter, Paul urged them to seek after God's wisdom and to keep growing and maturing in their faith. And then he got into details. He started talking about specific areas of their lives that those who follow Jesus need to submit to Christ. And if you were with us last week, we talked about one of those areas. We talked about sex and what God has to say about it and what it means to submit that to him. Well, this week, we're to another section, and guess what? Paul's addressing relationships. As it turns out, we're not the only one with questions about these. See, the beginning of this chapter, he says, now for the matters you wrote about. So we don't know exactly what those questions were, but we know that the church in Corinth, they were having some issues as well. They were saying, how do we do relationships? What does God want for us? So what does Paul do? He starts sharing God's truth with them. In this chapter, there's 40 verses where he talks about different aspects about relationships, and he talks to a whole bunch of different groups. He talks to the widows, he talks to the people who are married, he talks to engaged people, essentially, and to single people. At first, when I look at this chapter, it's pretty tempting for me to zoom in on specific, oh, this is the stage I'm in, or this is the stage I want to be in. What does Paul have to say here? And there is validity in each of those things, but Paul is also painting a bigger picture for us. So he's giving us specific instruction for how God wants us to live in different stages, different areas of relationship, but he's also telling us this pretty big truth. He's saying our relationship with God is what matters most. Our relationship with God matters, and that's why what God has to say about these different types of human relationships matters. That should inform the way we think about them and not just what we do. See, in the middle of the chapter, Paul's been talking about different types of relationships, and then all of a sudden he switches and he talks to the Corinthians about circumcision and slavery. He tells them, some of you were circumcised, some of you weren't when you came to know Christ. Some of you were slaves, some of you were free. Don't worry about that. That's not really what matters. Keeping God's commands is what matters. Now, when I first read this, it's just okay, Paul, tangent much? Where are we going with this? But then if you take a closer look at it, I noticed that 3 times in this little section, Paul talks about living in the situation God has set them in. Check out 1 Corinthians 7:17. Here's what he says exactly. Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Each person is to live as a believer in whatever situation. See, maybe Paul wasn't distracted at all. In fact, it's like he's using these other areas of life to point to them about this overarching truth, that our relationship with God is what matters most, even more than our relationship status. Okay, so if our main objective is to grow this relationship with God, then that means that in this area too, we want to look at what God has to say. And that's what Paul's been talking about. See, Paul knew something that I think you and I know too. We just have to kind of admit it, so I'm going to say it outright. Marriage is hard. Dating is hard. Singleness is hard. Life is hard, actually, right? But we serve a God that is good, and a God that wants good things for us, even in these areas of life that can be really, really difficult. And that's why he gave us instructions on how to live in these areas. That's why he has something to say here, because he wants it to go well for us instead of towards disaster. So tonight, what we're going to do is take a look at each of those areas. See, I think it's pretty easy for us when we're in one relationship status or the other to look at ours and kind of see only the bad things, and look at a different status and say, there's the blessings. That's what I want. That's what I long for. So tonight, instead of focusing in on just one, I've actually asked Callie and Tyler to come join me, and we're going to have a little discussion. We're going to talk about the barriers that we face in each area of relationship status, and we're going to talk about the blessings that God has for us there, and what it looks like to live as a follower of Christ throughout them all. So to get us started, we're just going to briefly introduce ourselves and give you our qualifications for talking about the different stages that we're covering tonight. So, Tyler, do you want to start?
Hi, everybody. There it is. I'm Tyler, and maybe some of you know, maybe some of you don't. I'm married, and I've been married for almost 5 years now. And my wife and I dated when we were in college and went through that whole deal. And so marriage is interesting because, for me, because I was wanting to procrastinate on us getting married, and actually circumstances and situations changed, and God was saying hey, you should get married earlier, and I wanted to be irresponsible. Not that being single is irresponsible, but for me, I wanted to kind of ease into being responsible once I graduated college, and God said, nope, you're going to get married and assume a lot of responsibility that way, and God has taught me a lot, and I have a lot to learn.
Thank you. So I'm Callie, and I have been in a relationship for almost a year now, and there's a lot of things I learned. Sometimes somewhat painful. Sometimes it's been fun. But one of the things that I've learned is that dating is kind of a balancing act in a lot of ways. And something that I will refer back to as we are talking, I'm sure, is that in a dating relationship, you're needing to grow in 4 areas. This is Callie's version. Other people might divide it up differently, but 4 areas in the physical, in the emotional, spiritual, and in time. And all of those 4 things need to be growing together. And should be growing as commitment grows. And each one of those things has a firm barrier that comes with it before marriage. And then after marriage, there can be barriers in those too. But that's kind of one part of what I've learned in dating.
Cool. And I'm Molly, and I would say my qualification for representing singleness is that I have been my entire life. I know, very qualified. But I would just say, like, kind of the opposite of Tyler is true for me. Maybe this is typical for girls, but I kind of had a certain picture in my mind of what my life was going to be, that I would, like, start dating in college, get married this summer after I graduated, by this point probably have several children, and that was kind of my whole plan for what my life would be. And needless to say, God has taken me on a different path, a different journey, and it's not been without its challenges. It's not always easy, but I've learned so much about both contentment and confidence in the Lord, because I think one of the big themes when I think about singleness, maybe you've heard people in the church, as I have, say singleness is a gift, and then you think in your head, it's the gift that no one wants. It's like when your grandma gives you underwear for Christmas. Why did you do that, Grandma? But I've just learned a lot over the years about how God is not giving a bad gift when he gives us a season of singleness. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But as we were talking and as we were looking through this chapter in 1 Corinthians and just thinking about what does it mean to be followers of Christ with each of these areas, with each of these seasons or stages, there were several big kind of topics that came out through this text and through our experiences. And so we want to explore those 3 big things. And the first one is actually the issue of sex. And yes, we talked about that last week if you were here. Don't worry, we're not covering all of the same stuff again tonight. But Paul brings that issue back up. He actually flows right from that other chapter into that. But here he's talking more about how sex applies in marriage, which is what God's intent was. And so to get us started on that issue and kind of looking at barriers and blessings within that, I'm going to let Tyler start because he's married.
Many people have this expectation, especially in the church. If you have this biblical understanding of sex, and sex is between a husband and wife and no other context, and we can almost idolize that, like, oh man, I'm going to get married and then I'm going to be able to have sex, yes. And we almost idolize that. And I remember my college friends, like, that was part of the conversation. It was almost less about, like, being married in that partnership and more like, we finally get to have sex, you know? And there's a God-given desire for that. Like, he has given us that desire, and that's not wrong. But it can become an idol when it becomes the main thing. And that's a barrier in marriage. The passage that we're focusing on tonight, in the context of sex, it says this: the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. That sex is a self-giving thing, and it can become very much a selfish thing. It can become very much a, I have these desires, I have these needs, and you need to meet them for me. And that's broken. And that can be a big barrier, that idolatry of sex, even within marriage. But then on the other side, sex is a blessing, and one of the things that this passage says is it helps with like dealing with temptation. He says that do not withhold yourselves from each other for too long, so that Satan doesn't get a foothold. It's a place where temptation can be thwarted as you're experiencing that together, but it's also the biblical understanding is that two become one flesh, and that happens within sex, and there's an intimacy there, both physical but but also emotional and spiritual and all those things that everybody says, and it sounds kind of cliche, but it's true. You become one, and that's a huge blessing of sex. It draws you together. Obviously, there's the whole family aspect. So there's that blessing there that seems kind of obvious, but there are also some what did I say? There's a blessing there, but there are also some barriers sometimes. So that's it.
Thanks, Tyler. So on the flip side, for those of you who are single, which actually applies to most everyone in this room, whether you're in a dating relationship or not, what do we do with this? As Tyler mentioned, God created sex and he made us as sexual beings, so it's not like something that the moment you say, I do, and the preacher says you may kiss your bride. So I don't know what they say, something like that. It doesn't like, oh, and now suddenly this like setting has changed. And this is part of who we are as people that God has made. And so what do we do with that? Well, obviously, as we talked about last week, there's a lot of things that people do with that are not what God has intended. There's a lot of temptation that we face. And so that is kind of the obvious barrier when we are in that stage of singleness. And Paul acknowledges that in this chapter. He talks about how singleness can be a really good season, a really good stage that God has for people. But he acknowledges that some burn with passion is the phrase he uses. And he's saying, hey, if this temptation is not something that you're controlling well, like marriage is the context that God has created for that expression. And so that's the barrier. That's the thing that we have to address. But as single people, like we're called to submit this area as well to the Lord and to say, hey, if you are God and I'm letting you be in control of my life, that means you get to be in charge of what I do with this aspect of myself as well. And that's where the blessing comes in. It may seem like there's actually no blessing when you're single, but I believe that there is. The blessing comes from being obedient to God. And it's a different sort of blessing. It's a blessing of being protected from harm. As Tyler talked about, the act of sex is a thing that includes every aspect of our being. And so whenever we're submitting to what God has said, whenever saying, hey, we agree with what you've asked of us here, we have the blessing of being protected from harm and getting to honestly exemplify what it means to be obedient to God. And that's a pretty cool testimony as well. So those are just a couple things.
So again, single while dating also, both kind of definitely identifiers for where I'm at and where you're at if you're in a dating relationship. And so a lot of the same barriers and blessings apply in a dating relationship as what Molly was talking about, like all of them. But there's the additional, I think, barrier in a dating relationship of having those conversations and figuring out where your boundary lines are, and then being accountable to holding those. And that can lead to awkward conversations and stuff. So that's kind of a boundary, or a kind of a barrier that happens in the dating world. And another barrier, which can turn into a blessing, I think, is sex / just intimacy, like physical intimacy, can deceive us, I think. Physical intimacy can distract us from like becoming intimate in other ways, getting to know each other, spending time with each other. That's quality time that's not actually like making out or something. That's just not the same as talking and figuring out, do we align on our spiritual views? Do we align on what we want for our lives? So if we're making decisions for our lifelong commitment based on like temporary physical pleasure or passions, it's not a great thing. It can lead to really unwise, and has led to many unwise decisions in people's lives. So the blessing of following what God says and putting sex into our minds as something that God gets to have say over means that our relationships can develop in a much more healthy way, and we can make commitments with clear heads. and get to know each other in real ways. It also means that you are a lot more free in a dating relationship. It means that you can not get married after you've been dating for a year and break up and still know that you've treated each other with respect and honor. And you can get married and there you go, it's fine. So there's some clear blessings in saying, God, you get to have the say over this.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so the second topic, as we were talking about, okay, what does it mean to live in each of these stages in kind of submission to what God is asking of us, was the area of personal spiritual growth. And so remember that verse we talked about a minute ago where it's like believers should live in the station that God has them. Well, another version, NASB, says they should walk in that manner. And this term walk kind of reminds us of this idea of following Christ. It's a phrase for discipleship. And so Paul is talking here about our personal follow after Christ aspect of our life. And so when we think about personal spiritual growth, you might be thinking, okay, how does that intersect with relationship stages? Well, I'll start with the whole area of singleness. So when it comes to being single and growing in our faith, there actually are some challenges. And you may not have faced all of these quite yet, but I'm guessing you've heard or seen some examples of this. So the first one is that sometimes in the church in America, we have put marriage on a pedestal and made people who are single to feel less than, which can leave people who are single kind of asking this question of, do I belong in the church? And I know that I've had that question a few times, and I know people who've struggled with that. That's a legitimate question, but what we do with that is kind of what matters. Whether or not we say, oh, I'm going to just walk away from this, or whether we say, okay, I'm going to seek after community. And that's the thing. When we say, hey, I'm going to seek after community, I'm going to seek out people who can challenge me and help me continue to grow in my relationship with God, even as a single person, I'll just tell you, there's like amazing blessings of that. I'll give you an example. So Callie and I go to a church here in town, and a few years ago we were like, hey, we don't really know where we fit exactly here, but we want people to walk alongside us. We want to be a part of community. We're not in college anymore, so we're not going to join the college group. We love college students, obviously, but we don't belong in the college group at our church. So we looked through the small group list, and we found one that was a general group, and we showed up, and the first night, everyone was married, and everyone told us that they had 4 kids, except for the last couple that said, we have 3 kids, but we're pregnant with our 4th. And we're like, cool, we're single. But guys, like, there was that moment of awkwardness. There was that moment where I said, oh, I don't know if I belong here. But then there was the part of me that maybe a little bit like rebelliously or stubbornly said, no, I'm going to be here. I'm going to say this is for me too. And I've seen God just use so many people in that group and even bring in more people from other generations. We've got older couples in there now. And just seeing that God can use all kinds of community within the church to grow us. We don't have to be a part of a marriage relationship to do that. One other blessing and barrier I'll mention is what we do with the time we have. So when we're single, we have a little bit more time, and sometimes we fill that up with a lot of other things. And that's okay to have hobbies. It's okay to do things we enjoy because God has created things for our enjoyment. But it's also possible to say, hey, I have extra time right now, and one blessing that could come from that is I can pursue things that I normally wouldn't, that are going to help me grow in my relationship with God. So maybe that's, hey, I can do extra Bible study. I can go on a spiritual retreat and see what this kind of spiritual discipline looks like. There's all kinds of ways we can use our time and leverage it to grow in our relationship with the Lord.
So maybe you've experienced this on a dating level where you've had a friend, you're hanging out all the time, you're super close, and then that friend starts dating somebody and you never see them again. That only is like infinitely elevated when it comes to marriage. A lot of times that can be the temptation. We're married now, So we only spend time with each other. We only stay at our house and watch Netflix all the time. And honestly, like, my first year of marriage was a lot of that. It's like, Amy, I just want to be with you all the time, so let's just stay home and do nothing and just look at each other in the eyes and say, I love you. So that happens sometimes. Newlyweds, crazy. But unfortunately, what that does is that cuts you off from Christian community. And like, you need more than just your spouse in a marriage to grow and to be encouraged. Like, you need, I need guys in my life who are good friends, who are going to hold me accountable, who I can hang out with and just have fun, but also can encourage me in my walk with Christ. And so one of the barriers is that it can really easily become like, we're just having our own little party over here, marriage party, and nobody else is allowed in, and that can really hinder our personal growth in the Lord. But on the blessing side of things, if we do it right, marriage is a great place for you to grow spiritually. One of the things that I was and still struggle with, but I was lazy. And one of the things that God had to get rid of in my life before I got married was that laziness. The reason why I wanted to kind of keep dating and not get married so soon was so that I can ease into like responsibility. I didn't have to think about insurance as quickly or budgeting as much or whatever. And God's like, no, you're going to get married way sooner than you expected. Ha! And so God can use that to grow us. Marriage is a great place where you're basically like looking in a mirror. Like, what I do and who I am very directly affects my wife and vice versa. And so that's a huge like place where we can grow, and there's so much blessing in that.
So as a dating person, I'm kind of like in between them-ish. Funny. Anyway, you guys didn't think it was that funny? Well, thanks. So I am still single, but I'm dating. So I am still responsible for my personal spiritual maturity, and I'm still supposed to be pursuing those relationships and doing the same things that both Tyler and Molly need to do to remain spiritually healthy. And I think a barrier can be being distracted, just like Tyler was talking about, by the dating relationship. And also a barrier can be relying too much on your significant other for that spiritual encouragement. And also another barrier is like not inviting him or her into that side of you enough. Like I said before, you're wanting these levels, these parts of yourself to be growing together with your commitment. And if your spiritual life isn't a part of your dating relationship, I mean, I'm not married, but I don't think it's going to be a big part of your marriage relationship either. So while you're balancing your time, you're also trying to, your time and relational energy, you're trying to assess, like, is this person a person that's going to spur me on? Is this person a person that I am spiritually compatible with, and that I'm excited to serve God with? So that can be a lot. I mean, there's just a lot of things I think to think about and to keep in balance. But I do have the benefit of having someone that is telling me things, giving me feedback that like Molly is not going to give me, telling me, things that no one else has told me before. I'm like, what? Are you sure? Dang it, that's true. And I've been processing and getting a lot of feedback and trying to make changes because I have someone there telling me, when you do this, it's hurtful, or when you don't do this, it's hurtful, or this is a good thing that I see in you.
Thanks, Callie. Okay, so we've got one more area. And that last area is this idea of leveraging our relationship status for the kingdom. In 1 Corinthians 7:32 through 34, Paul says this: I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. So, singleness, blessing or curse, gift or curse. Paul talks about it here, and he points out that there is an obvious blessing. If you're unmarried, if you're single, you have this opportunity to use this time, this freedom, this lack of concern about needing to care for another person, to be completely devoted to the Lord. And when we look at it that way, man, what a blessing of singleness, right? Like, man, I can do anything that God asks me. I could pick up and move to another country tomorrow. I could spend all of my free time serving the Lord. I could so easily volunteer with youth. There's so many things that being single allows us to do, to be devoted to the Lord. And that sounds maybe like cliche, and there have been times where I heard that and it just felt like someone slapping something on me like, oh, you're the one responsible to do all these things because you're single. That was kind of a wrong perspective, I think. It can feel that way, but also it can be a gift. And I think about not only my life and how that's become true. The fact of the matter is I would not be sitting here with you guys. I wouldn't get to hang out with you guys if I was married. If my life had gone the way I had planned, it would look different. And I think about people who've graduated and gone out from here, from our ministry, even in the last few years, and I came up with a list pretty quickly of 4 or 5 students who are unmarried and who are serving God cross-culturally as teachers and more. And then I also came up with a list of people who are unmarried and are serving the Lord in their workplaces, but also in their churches. See, they're teachers and they're working in business and entertainment industries, but they're also finding ways to serve in their church. And they're saying, hey, God, you get to have my singleness. I'm going to see this as a blessing. But the barrier, I think, on the singleness side to leveraging our relationship status for the kingdom, it comes back to a mindset. Because if we choose to see it as a curse, then we're going to find ourselves discontent. We're going to find ourselves waiting for our life to start and just believing that God can't use us until we're part of a marriage unit. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but I'm going to let Callie and Tyler talk. So Tyler, you want to take it away?
It's often talked about in pop culture and sometimes in the church. You need to marry somebody who makes you happy. And I don't think that's a bad thing, that my wife makes me happy, and I hope vice versa. We'll see about that. But first of all, that's not always true. Like, there are some times where we don't make each other happy, but then I think there's a much, much deeper reason to get married. And I think if your decision, A, to be married, and B, to be married to this person, is not a kingdom decision, is not a God-focused decision, it's going to wind up in the category that Paul is describing, where he says the married man is distracted. He can't concentrate on God because he's too concerned with pleasing his wife. He's too concerned with his marriage. And so that was huge for me. I read this passage literally 2 weeks before I got married. And it was frightening. I was like, what am I doing? Like, I've done so wrong. And I spent some time in prayer, like, God, am I supposed to walk down the aisle in 2 weeks? Like, what's happening? And God was reminding me, no, like, there are other passages in the Bible that are really like pro-marriage, like yay, marriage. But also, God was reminding me that this is a kingdom decision. Like, if you're coming together and you're doing it for the Lord, you're saying, here are the gifts that we have. Here's the direction that even our careers are lining up, where we can be greater than the sum of our 2 parts. Then that's what we want to do. And we want to keep Jesus at the center and as the reason for our marriage, not even each other as much as Jesus. And so there's a barrier there, though, because we can make our family, our spouse, just everything. That American dream, spouse and 2.5 kids and a dog and a white picket fence, and we can make that the absolute goal in our lives in marriage. But it's just not true. The goal is to make disciples of all nations, and our marriages should line up with that. Otherwise, I think they're not honoring God.
And here I am again. And I definitely have a level of freedom that Tyler does not have. and I have a little bit more responsibility to someone else than Molly does. And I think balance, darn. I know that's not super helpful sometimes, but this is not really necessarily an easy thing to discern. Keeping Christ at the center of your dating relationship, when you're just trying to kind of get to know this person as well, and there's a lot of things you're trying to figure out, and you're trying to talk about what gifts you do have, what gifts do they have, where are your passions, like where do you want to serve in the church, and how do those things work together? Because you're probably pretty different than your significant other, hopefully, and the way that you understand service is probably going to be somewhat different. The way that you approach serving God is going to be somewhat different. So discerning what service to God looks like together, and discerning whether you are a good kingdom match takes, I think, a lot of prayer, a lot of hopefully support from community, and humbleness, I think, as well. And it also takes keeping that balance of remembering that you are single and that you do have freedom and that you need to not spend all the time together, but you do need to spend some time together, balance. So there's a barrier there, I think, in there's a lot of things that you're trying to hold in your mind, and that is an emotional and relational toll, while you're also trying to serve in other areas, because you still do have freedom to serve, at Campus House or wherever that may be. And again, on the blessing side, you do have someone that is spurring you on, hopefully encouraging you towards service, and it's exciting to talk about dreams and ways that you could serve God together. It's exciting to see someone else's heart and their passion for Christ, and we need that encouragement, and dating is one way that you get that, I think.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for sharing. I don't know about you guys, but as we talk about what it could look like to let God dictate how we live life in each of these stages, honestly, I get pretty excited about how every one of these stages can be used to better the kingdom of God. It's a pretty cool thing. And there's a lot more we could talk about, and a lot of issues that we kept thinking like, oh this, oh that. There's no way we can talk about all of them tonight, so we're just admitting that. Sorry if we didn't answer the thing that you've been thinking about, but here's what we have for you. We have a resource list of a bunch of books written by a bunch of different people that are way smarter than us, and also podcasts and things you can listen to, and that resource list is over on the terminal table, so feel free to grab one of those afterwards. And then there's one other thing. On October 18th, so in just a couple weeks, we're going to have a question answer type night to talk about relationships and sex and everything we've been talking about the last 2 weeks in another format where you guys can bring in the questions that you have, and we'll have some guests here to help share with you some wisdom. Guys, the band can come back up as I finish. See, this theme we've had this semester, mosaic, fitting into the bigger picture, I feel like that's exactly what God is calling us to when it comes to our relationship statuses. He's not saying, I only want the single people or I only want the married people. He wants us all. Every stage, every story is a piece that can help paint this bigger picture that God is using to call people back towards him. Towards the end of the chapter, Paul offers us this powerful reminder, 1 Corinthians 7:29 through 31. What I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it is not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them, for this world in its present form is passing away. It's a call to perspective. See, none of those things are bad. Paul's not saying, hey, you don't need a house, or hey, relationships don't matter. It's not important if you're sad or if you're happy. What he's saying is those things are temporary. When held up against the scope of eternity, these things are short. No matter how many days or years any one of us has, our lives are fleeting. And so Paul's saying, not don't ever care about those things, But he's saying, keep in mind what matters the most. Now, I know there are probably some of you here tonight who've never said, hey, I want to follow Jesus. You've never made that decision to say your life is his. I just want to say that any of the CCH staff would absolutely love to talk with you more about what that means. See, we believe this is a choice to follow someone who wants good things for our eternal lives, but also for our lives here and now, who's inviting us to a better, more purposeful, more joyful way to live right here. So if you're curious, ask. We'll answer anything you want to know. For those of us who've chosen to follow Jesus, Paul's just saying, hey, this is another area where we want to submit to God's authority. We want to be faithful disciples, offering him every day, every stage, and saying, what will you do with me now? How can I be a part of your kingdom?